tú hablabas un poco de la arquitectura y me parece importante también destacar que, no sé, en los 90 se empezaron a construir museos que se convirtieron en íconos de la arquitectura, como grandes esculturas públicas, pero que no necesariamente corresponden con lo que un museo necesitaría. Y creo que es el gran reto de quienes trabajamos dentro del museo, lograr un equilibrio entre el contenedor y el contenido. Porque, por ejemplo, el MUSAC es un edificio de Mansilla y Tuñón que ganó el premio Mies van der Rohe en el 2007 al mejor edificio europeo. Y es un museo muy interesante a nivel de arquitectura, pero genera muchos problemas porque a nivel de museografía tenemos que trabajar mucho, y el reto es de qué forma encontramos en esos espacios tan complicados la forma de mostrar ciertas obras y que el edificio no se coma el trabajo o el proyecto que el artista está proponiendo. Entonces creo que sí sería muy interesante que se lograra una verdadera comunicación entre quien está diseñando el edificio y entre quienes van a usar después el edificio, al igual que en una casa. Cuando tú mandas a hacer una casa o se construye un edificio, hay como una discusión y es importante que esa discusión exista. Y en ese sentido me parece muy importante el proyecto que están haciendo Julia y Hans en Serpentine, de invitar cada año un arquitecto que no ha construido nada en Londres para que desarrolle un proyecto de pabellón en el que van a ocurrir ciertas actividades a lo largo del verano y el otoño, porque ahí hay realmente un verdadero diálogo y hay una propuesta y hay una interacción que genera después una serie de actividades muy ricas y muy dinámicas.
And it's interesting also, I mean, you mentioned these art tanks, no? And I saw this extraordinary project there which Stuart Kommer had curated with experimental film, and suddenly in this art tank experimental film appeared, you know, in a completely, I mean, it was a very new experience, a very unique experience. And I think this idea, I mean, it leads us back to Cedric Price really, because very often, I mean, the Fan Palace had a lot to do with your question, you know, what about flexibility, and it is this big paradox of what can we, if we start from this idea, what Alighiero Boetti said is that we should really listen to artists about the museum, and so what we can do as good as we can is that we can be as close as we can to artists in the present and extrapolate eventually from that, you know, what a museum in the future would need. But then who knows what a next generation of artists will want, and, you know, what will there be necessary for this. And so that's why obviously Cedric Price came to this conclusion that a museum should have a limited lifespan. He said, you know, let's build a Fan Palace, let's have it for 10, 20 years, and then rethink, you know, and reassess. But that's obviously also difficult at the current moment of sustainability, and you know, which is different from the early 60s, because I think now things have to be sustainable. So, and that's why I think many of the ideas of Price are interesting, because I think it's interesting also how we can actually use old spaces and give them a completely new meaning and recharge them. And I mean, the art tanks are such an example. And then at the same time add new architecture. But the new architecture does not necessarily have to be prescriptive and homogenizing. And I think that that's maybe the danger of big museum buildings of the last 20 years, which is that they are gigantic new buildings which leave relatively little space for, you know, and I think it's important to think about this possibility of what we can do in terms of diversity, and that's somehow it's a mix really between Cedric Price Fan Palace, which is a very 20th century idea, but it's still relevant now, and then Edouard Glissant, who thinks the museum also in a non-Western way, because I think what is so important about Edouard Glissant is that total shift of the center, and that Edouard Glissant suddenly thinks the museum from Martinique. What does it mean from the point of view of Martinique, a museum of the 21st century? And so I think if somehow we combine Cedric Price and Edouard Glissant, we can find answers to your highly complex question.
Also, another point very interesting to discuss, you made an emphasis in artists. For example, here in Latin America, in our reality, it's very rare to have a program, or I'm referring to museums, to produce work with artists. I mean, to allow artists to feel close to the curators and in general, all the crew, all the team in a museum, to produce the work that is going to be exhibited, or in a dynamic of the work of the museum in any kind of situation that it could be. But there isn't any strength nowadays in Latin America to support that sort of relationship with artists. So maybe to strengthen that point of view is very important for the future of the museum, or what do you think? Do you work with artists in those sort of dynamics in La Tate, for example?
Yeah. The Tate has it's been a fairly new relationship towards artists to act as a producer or facilitator or commissioner of projects. And the most important expression of that has been the Turbine Hall projects, which have initiated a completely new relationship between the Tate as a museum organization and artists and their work. I think this is, and there have been a parallel project at Tate Britain to use the Devine galleries, the central historic galleries of Tate Britain, for artist commissions as well. It is a very challenging realm in which to work with artists, but it's incredibly important. And I think if institutions in Latin America are able to develop that sort of a relationship with artists, it's going to be an incredibly important one, because it enriches the possibilities for artists to develop their careers and to test new projects. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on the scale of a Turbine Hall project in order to create new possibilities within artistic practice. I think that the scale is sometimes misleading in that respect. And the scale of the Turbine Hall, whilst being extraordinary, is also, you know, it's not necessary in order to push artistic practice into new areas. It presents its own set of challenges, of course, but it's not an absolute requirement. So I think that there are ways in which museums can work with artists within the realm of possibilities of their particular circumstances. I think it's just sometimes a way of allowing yourself the freedom of thinking through the possibilities and the ways in which one can dialogue with artistic practice. But I think Hans is absolutely right that the museum has to follow artists and to be a truthful reflection of where artistic practice is developing and moving in any given moment in time. So you have to have that sense of proximity to artistic practice in order to remain a relevant institution and to engage with a broader to have a broader social role as well.
I mean, that's very interesting, I think, in terms of the idea of scale, no? And I think all kinds of scale give different forms of possibility, and I think particularly now, I mean, you know, we are a very small institution, you know, and which in some kind of way, from that point of view, develops other forms of dialogues, and I think alliances are very important. I think there is alliances between many smaller institutions can be as strong as, you know, big institutions. I think one of the great opportunities and possibilities of this, you know, new century will also be more collaboration, particularly in the moment. I mean, as I think was mentioned before, I think Maria Inés mentioned it, that there is a, you know, an economic crisis in terms of funding of museums in, you know, in Europe, and obviously the question is how, you know, to answer to that. And I think one of the main answers is this idea of new alliances. So that basically, and it's true for big museums and small museums, know how there can be actually new alliances between art institutions, but also between art institutions and other parts in society, and maybe other institutions in society, between art museums and science museum, between art museum and architecture museum. And all these new alliances will, you know, maintain the possibility to produce. And I mean, we at the moment do no exhibition really which doesn't travel. All our exhibition travels, and very often they travel to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 cities, you know, and it's basically very rare that we will only go to 2 or 3 cities. So it's very much sort of on the move. And that obviously allows economically to produce. It allows, you know, also to produce exhibition literature. it implies another danger, and the danger is obviously that it becomes a kind of a packaging, and that one starts to send, you produce an exhibition in London, and then you send it around the world, which is not, I don't think that that's interesting. So I think the traveling is then an opportunity to make it more as a learning system, and that each time it's a different venue, and each time it answers locally so that the exhibition, wherever it appears, it's different. I mean, something we've experimented a long time ago with Do It, for example. Whenever Do It appears somewhere, it's done locally, it's interpreted locally, it has local, input. And a similar thing, I think, is true for museum show. I mean, for example, our current show, Indian Highway, which is touring, which is a focus on Indian art, it's changing wherever it goes. And we collaborated, it was a Serpentine, Gallery Astro Fernley co-production, and it now tours to Moscow, it tours to Brazil, it will tour to the Middle East, it will go finally also back to India, and wherever this exhibition happens, we add new modules which are locally, impulsed with local curators, and so I think there's a lot of possibility there to answer this.
Pero tú decías que en Latinoamérica como que no hay un espacio o no hay las posibilidades para producir, pero creo que...
No, es que es débil, pues.
Es débil, pero es que depende también a lo que nos refiramos, a qué te refieres con producción, porque no necesariamente es producir una pieza, como decía Tanya, a gran escala en un museo. Por ejemplo, en México se están generando cantidad de proyectos súper interesantes con la comunidad y son los artistas los que generan esos proyectos. Y así el museo se vuelve mucho más dinámico y mucho más cercano a la audiencia a la que se está refiriendo. En Colombia yo creo que si Beatriz González no hubiera sido la profesora que fue de todos nosotros, muchísimas cosas no hubiesen sido posibles. Y también es un artista que está dentro del museo generando pensamiento, generando debate y creando escuela. Entonces creo que ese tipo de cosas son muy importantes en Latinoamérica y Europa adolece de ese tipo de fuerza y de intervención de parte del artista. Y sí me parece muy importante lo que dice Tanya con relación a la escala, porque a veces quedamos bastante maravillados con proyectos como por ejemplo el Turbine Hall, que es impresionante, pero al mismo tiempo es una trampa para la institución porque atrae tantas personas que al final se vuelve como un supermercado en el que no hay espacio para cuestionar y para decidir qué es lo que estamos viendo, ¿no? Entonces creo que sí hay que tener mucho cuidado con esa idea de que se puede producir o no se puede producir, siempre se puede producir. Y tal vez el gesto más sencillo, más simple y más invisible pueda ser como el gesto más importante que genere un cambio radical unos años después. En Medellín, por ejemplo, las bienales fueron súper importantes, generaron ciertas cosas después. Gracias a ese antecedente se pudo hacer el encuentro de Medellín en el 2007. No había muchísimo dinero, se lograron producir muchas cosas, que gente fuera a Medellín, que los espacios locales recibieran espacios de diferentes partes del mundo, que artistas generaran proyectos en la ciudad, que se generara después una casa del encuentro que quedó como un espacio de arte contemporáneo. Entonces creo que esa dinámica es muy importante y sí creo que Latinoamérica ahora, Brasil, Argentina, Latinoamérica ahora es la fuente de muchísimas ideas y de muchísimo movimiento y realmente nosotros tenemos ahora un proyecto que empezó en junio y que va a durar 6 meses, ahora nuestras exposiciones duran mucho más tiempo que antes, y lo que quisimos fue mostrar toda la colección que tenemos de América Latina. Es una exposición que ocupa todas las salas del museo, son 45 artistas y mostramos, algunas piezas son bastante importantes, otras son gestos, otras son intervenciones en el mismo edificio, y realmente es interesante constatar cómo en Latinoamérica hay tal energía y tal interés por generar debate y por intentar que desde el arte se puedan generar espacios de cambio y espacios de reflexión que en España pues están como dándose cuenta de que hay algo en lo que como que estamos quedados en algo, ¿no? Digo estamos porque pues trabajo en Europa desde hace 20 años y pues también me imagino que me he quedado en varias cosas y ahora estamos aprendiendo muchísimo de lo que estamos viendo gracias a este proyecto que dura 6 meses.
No, we completely agree, and just trying to point out that that's the future of our museums also, to be close to the artists, to produce with the community and also with many sort of artists, not only that the in other times used to call artists, no? But also people who works with edition and production itself, and a huge crew of people that join together to do things and not to produce objects mainly. No, that's a new challenge also. No, but we completely agree.
Maybe one thing we haven't mentioned, and that would be the topic of a whole other debate. We don't have the time today. Is obviously the whole question of public and private. Will the future of the museum be public? Will the future of the museum be private? What you can observe right now in Europe is an extraordinary amount of new private initiatives, of which many are actually extremely interesting, which are new private museums, and the question will be what will be the sustainability of these museums in the long term, what will happen to public institutions if more and more private institutions happen, and what will be the support of the public institutions, how are sort of public-private partnerships happening, and it's such a huge topic, and again it will be very important as always to listen to artists, what they think.
So unfortunately, the times has run out, so we need to finish now. Vamos a terminar ahora y les agradecemos muchísimo. Si tienen alguna pregunta para nuestros panelistas, podemos contestar brevemente. ¿Puedo tomar esto, Moisés?
Hi. Well, I would like to share with you my experience with Colombian museums. I used to think that museums were like places with very valuable collections, but the interaction with the museums as an spectator was not that comfortable for me. And I remember I went to the Tate in 2003, and I remember there was a huge sun inside the Tate, and when I went there, I wasn't expecting that. I tried to have like the normal experience with a museum, but for me it was unbelievable to lay on the floor, to see other people like with towels in the floor and watching themselves into the roof, in the roof and all that. And it was amazing, and it's something that I cannot forget. And I remember that time I thought, I wish these kind of things happen in Colombia. But then I came here and I saw an exhibition that gave me like the same experience. I don't know if it was known by everybody, but the name of that exhibition was the Food Festival. I remember seeing plenty of stencils in the streets, and I wanted to know who made it, but I didn't know how. This festival was with all the street artists, and it was in a hotel that wasn't working. It was Bandung, and it was 12 floors with stencils of Colombian street artists, and it was so nice to see that, and to see that it was going to be just for a few days. And it had all the harmony of the essential of that street art. So it was really nice to see it, and it was really nice for me to see that in Colombia that kind of exhibition is happening too. I don't know how it's going to be now for Colombia, like the experience of a museum, and to see like how it's going to work now with the new art and the new experiences. But I just wanted you to know, like you were talking about Latin American art and Mexican art and Brazil art, and in Colombia it's also happening. I don't know if it's that known by everybody, but it's happening, and I'm glad to see that in my country too.
Gracias.
Well, I think, you know, it wasn't. This was a real case of us learning from working with an artist. The turbine hall project that you were referring to was the one by Olafur Eliasson called the Weather Project, which we staged in 2003 to 2004. And it was a way in which the museum learned a lot about itself and about what it could be to the audience through the genuine response and reaction that occurred to that display. And you're right, there were people lying in the turbine hall, spending hours there, creating very different kinds of behaviors to the ones that we usually expect from museum visitors in Britain. And I think, you know, if you follow stereotypes, the British are quite reserved. So for this to have occurred in Britain was quite something, but it was an abject lesson in learning how we could learn from artists and the way in which they would create the circumstances for a new definition of what artistic practice could be, and then underlying that, what the art museum can and should be in the 21st century. And I think that yes, Latin America is incredibly important to the Tate and has become very important over the last 8 to 10 years. And of course, there was a very important example of that staged in the Turbine Hall a few years ago, which was Doris Salcedo's Turbine Hall intervention. So people are aware of Colombia as a source of cutting-edge artistic practice in the UK. So this is something that also we have to begin to think much more broadly about in the institutions such as Tate. But I think that it's incredibly interesting to hear that there is some broadening of activity happening here in Colombia as well.
It's also very interesting. I mean, several things. First of all, for the very reason what you mentioned, that's why we are here, no? Because I mean, we are here because we feel it's very urgent to find out more about art in Colombia, making studio visits, and it's the beginning of a research, you know, which we feel is very, very important. And I mean, one of the things which again is important is to see that, and that's something which has been previously in my research is always the case, is to obviously not only look what is happening now, but again try to learn from, you know, experiments in the past. And there have been very exciting curatorial experiments in Latin America in the past. And I mean, when I did my research in Mexico, it was very, very important to have all these models from the past. I mean, if we think it's still ongoing, if you think about the extraordinary experiment of Toledo, no, what he's doing in Oaxaca, and has a lot to do with, resonates with what you mentioned about the sort of a street museum and also museum of communities and different communities, is something which has been incredibly, you know, inspiring to me. Or if one thinks about the Ditela Institute as one of the great laboratories, you know, you can put that very much into the same category as what Pontus Sultan did at the same time, you know, in Europe. Or then in terms of architecture, you know, I think it's incredibly interesting what Ramirez Vasquez, whom I went to interview, he's now in his 80s, you know, did with the Anthropology Museum in Mexico. And I'm sure, you know, the more we're going to research here, we're going to hopefully also find here experiments, curatorial experiments, museum experiments, all kinds of experiments from the artist experiments from the past, which can inspire us and help to build the future.
Bueno, vamos a seguir con la última pregunta. Se tienen que ir.
Hi, I represent the two only museum of south of Bogota, the Museum of Leather and the Museum of Forties. This museum represent 3 million of people.
¿Por qué no? Porque, perdóname, te interrumpo. Es que el sonido no está muy bien hacia acá. ¿Por qué no hablas un poquito en español y yo traduzco brevemente, pero muy brevemente, por favor, concreta la pregunta? Gracias.
Gracias. Yo represento a los dos únicos museos que tiene el sur de Bogotá, el Museo del Cuero y el Museo de los Años 40, que representan a una población de 3 millones de habitantes. En este marco son los únicos museos que existen y son privados. ¿Cuál es el futuro de la relación de cooperación internacional para la colaboración con entidades, para comunidades que no tienen representada hasta el momento la participación de su patrimonio y de su quehacer cultural dentro de espacios alternativos para el nuevo uso y las nuevas de los museos? Gracias.
He is asking about international support to non-common practices, that mean non-conventional practices and non-conventional spaces, and he's asking about if you have any idea about support, international support, in that sense.
Me parece muy interesante tu pregunta porque creo que ahora la cuestión, hablando de esta crisis económica que nos está golpeando tan fuerte, la cuestión no es tanto qué tipo de museo somos, sino qué tipo de conexiones y de redes de trabajo constituimos con los museos locales, con los museos nacionales y con los museos internacionales. Y no solamente museos, también universidades. Por ejemplo, la UNAM en el DF tiene los museos más importantes de la ciudad. Acaban de abrir el MUAC hace 3, 4 años y se ha convertido realmente en un espacio increíble de trabajo, de investigación, que está relacionado directamente con una universidad que es la que lo financia. Entonces, ahora que estamos viviendo un momento tan difícil, todos tenemos que buscar amigos y compañeros de trabajo, y eso no solamente sirve a nivel financiero, sino también a nivel de las ideas. La semana pasada hablaba justamente de eso con Cuauhtémoc Medina, que trabajó con Tanya en Tate en la parte de Latinoamérica, y creo que es uno de los intelectuales más interesantes de Latinoamérica en este momento, y él me preguntaba de qué forma quieres colaborar con el MUAC, qué quieres hacer con MUAC, y bueno, ya tenemos algunas exposiciones que vamos a coproducir, porque así las vamos a poder hacer. Pero lo que yo le planteaba era, lo que necesitamos hacer ahora es un grupo de estudio. Ahora solamente estamos hablando de dinero, estamos haciendo negocios. Los museos grandes y poderosos proponen a los museos del tercer mundo, donde no hay una crisis tan grave, que compren sus exposiciones. Creo que ahora, en este momento, ya no podemos seguir aceptando ese tipo de intercambios. Ahora tenemos es que pensar juntos de qué forma desarrollamos nuestra programación, qué ideas podemos desarrollar juntos y de qué forma podemos realmente avanzar un poco en las diferentes investigaciones. Y eso sería mucho más interesante porque podríamos crear equipos de investigación entre diferentes museos que trabajen 2, 3 años y lo podríamos financiar. Ahora solos no podemos hacer ese tipo de proyectos. Entonces creo que si tú trabajas en 2 museos que tienen una gran riqueza de trabajo y de contenido, pues lo que hay que buscar es gente que se acerque a tus ideas, gente que sea cercana a lo que ustedes están proponiendo, para poder enriquecer un poco más ese debate y para poder como ocupar un poco más el espacio, ¿ves? A nivel conceptual me refiero.
Muchas gracias. Gracias por haber estado aquí con nosotros y gracias a ustedes también por acompañarnos.